So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Opergy kind of internal behind-the-scenes webinar and a bit of a group chat with some of my esteemed colleagues. I'm Jonathan Reynolds, Group Managing Director here at Opergy, and today I'm joined by three fantastic colleagues who each bring a different perspective on the energy, climate, industrial policy landscape we've all been navigating over the last few weeks. With me, and I'll introduce them shortly, Sarah Nidri-Webb, one of our senior consultants who leads on our policy, socioeconomics, strategic analysis across loads of our major programs. Aaron Attry, consultant, specialising in energy markets, supply chains and industrial strategy. And Rachel Jennings, senior analyst, bringing deep analytical insights across our climate policy, regional development and some of our clean energy transition planning. We're going to spend the next kind of 30 minutes or so unpacking what's been happening on the global stage at COP30, what the autumn budget and the new North Sea Future Plan mean for the UK energy system, and how the major announcement in the past 24 hours, GB Energy Strategic Plan, Ofgem's new regulatory framework and 28 billion investment, but also Sizewell C's economic impact study and how they start to change that landscape again. What we thought we were going to talk about has already changed in the last 24 hours with latest policy announcements and new reports. But together they kind of give us a clearer, though still pretty complicated picture of where the transition is heading, where momentum is starting to build and where the gaps start to really remain. But importantly, where Opergy and our team needs to position itself and supporting our clients. So I'm going to break it down a little bit in terms of setting the scene, and then I'll bring the team in to have a little bit of a panel discussion. So let's talk about COP30, the COP of truth that perhaps didn't quite deliver. Personal opinion, perhaps. So it was billed as a moment the world would shift decisively from pledging to implementation. And some of the packages tried to set the tone, or closing the implementation gap, improving cooperation, launching a new global implementation accelerator, and helping countries turn their sort of national contributions and adaptation plans into delivery. But for me, I think the gap between rhetoric and reality still remained pretty stark. I think we saw some improved architecture. We saw the just transition mechanism, and the new indicators for the global goal on adaptation. All 60 of them, 60 different metrics. That's on top of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are pretty well understood around the world. But we didn't see the decisive global signals on fossil fuel phase down. Almost 90 nations backed a roadmap, but it failed to land. And we've been here before, we're going around that cycle. And climate finance, especially around adaptation finance, it continues to lag. The tripling commitment by 2035 is greatly welcomed, but it's 5 years later than originally proposed and with no clear baseline. So the message from COP30 was pretty clear. It has broad commitment, but we're still nowhere near delivery at the pace that we require it. So I think this places even more pressure on national policies to lead. So coming on to the autumn statement, and post-COP, what we're kind of seeing is Rachel Reeves and Treasury going to kind of start to put the leadership in place, and mixed messages here. So the autumn budget, the North Sea Future Plan, it was announced there, gave us a bit of a direction of travel, but perhaps some missing mechanisms. So domestically, the budget and the accompanying document set a pretty clear narrative. Clean energy is now firmly framed as a generator of growth. Energy security, lower bills. So we're starting to reframe kind of narrative around net zero. Nuclear, really important, in particular, was the most strongly backed technology in the budget. But the big surprise, and perhaps the biggest concern, was the decision to extend the energy profits levy to 2030. Really quite challenging for Scotland in terms of particularly those around Aberdeen, and some of the strong political voices in supporting oil and gas. I think this reshapes the investment profile for the North Sea, though, and it risks accelerating disinvestment faster than the transition architecture can support. The budget's own narrative kind of tried to emphasise stability, fairness, and a more managed kind of transition, what we call the just transition. But the energy profits levy kind of pulls in the opposite direction, undermining supply chain continuity and increasing risk. But we also saw bill reductions through the levy reforms, which was welcome for households, but potentially weakens the retrofit incentive, certainly in the short term. The saving on average of £150 per household was great. Almost a potential political masterstroke in terms of the challenge that we see with reform, kind of challenging some of the net zero subsidies or the renewable subsidies on bill payers. But we'll come on to it a bit later. Perhaps that's kind of been undone a little bit by the Ofgem announcement today that's going to add more cost onto energy bills, but we'll perhaps explore that. I think we also saw the stronger strategic commitment to offshore wind, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, but also the ports, which is great. But notably without the deployment or kind of the fiscal investment structures that they actually need. So renewed focus on the North Sea future plan, but again, without the detailed investment programs that turn intent into delivery. So for me, I think we've got some clear direction, but we're not yet there in terms of delivery mechanisms. So we know what we want to do. We're not quite sure how we're going to do it. And then in the last 24 hours, we've seen a number of new announcements. So against that backdrop, these feel particularly relevant for to bring into the chat today. So we've seen the Great British Energy Strategic Plan, finally starts to sort of codify a much more coordinated approach to whole system planning, generation networks, flexibility, demand reduction, looking at some of the targets of 10,000 jobs by 2030, 1,000 local community energy projects, 15 gigawatts or 15 billion of private investment leverage. Some great stats. And I think it does give a shift or signals a shift towards long-term certainty for investors. Brilliant. But for me, there's still a question on how and who and when, because they're breaking down perhaps it is to the next level of detail, but some great statement of intent. We've got the Ofgem 5-year framework that's been announced again. So the new sort of 28 billion investment in sort of accelerated sort of grid projects, a more strategic approach to anticipatory investments, which is great to see. It's been something we've been pushing for a while, and quicker, hopefully more certain regulatory process. So all of that's essential for unlocking, offshore wind, solar, storage projects, all of which with a sort of queuing, behind grid constraints, which again have been in the headlines for quite some time. But it will, as I said earlier, kind of raise household bills modestly in the near term out to 2030, 2031. So we've got this kind of Chancellor, offering a bit back in terms of the £150 savings, but Ofgem kind of putting it back onto the bills. Unfortunately, over the sort of medium term. And then we've got, finally, the Sizable Sea report that's been announced today. So looking at economic impact, study of Sizable Sea for the whole UK economy, 26.6 billion GVA during construction, 256,000 job years of employment, again, during construction, significant amount, 8.7 billion in tax revenues, 34 billion over its lifetime in terms of contribution back to Treasury. But perhaps the most striking was the local impact for Suffolk, the host county for Sizewell, projecting a 22% uplift in gross value added to the local economy by 2050, which then outperforms every other UK region. And I think the Sizewell Sea contribution to energy security is equally clear. Non-weather dependent baseload, which reduces system costs by an estimated just over £2 billion per year, complementing renewables, not competing with it. And for us at Opergy, deeply involved in Sizewell Sea from a workforce, skills, socioeconomic ecosystem perspective, that kind of, I'm really proud to see that particular report, be published today, which we've been part of. So where does this leave us? And I will introduce the team in a second, I promise you. So stepping back, a few themes come into sharp focus, certainly for me. I think number one, the UK is finally beginning to speak the language of implementation, but we haven't quite yet built the machinery or the mechanisms to deliver it. COP30 captured it globally, GB Energy, Ofgem are moving in that direction nationally, but we're still seeing some deployment barriers that remain unresolved. Two, nuclear firmly back as an industrial economic pillar for UK growth. Brilliant. Between Sizewell C, Hinkley Point C, small modular reactors, the budget's narrative, and now very clear articulation of the economic case. Nuclear is not just about energy projects now, it is its own industrial strategy. Brilliant to see. Three, supply chain risk is now one of the biggest strategic issues. For whether it's offshore wind volatility to North Sea fiscal uncertainty, grid bottlenecks, energy storage bottlenecks. The UK's got to now protect and grow the very industrial capacity that we need to deliver the transition. This is about projects, but the manufacturing and the engineering supply chains that support and deliver those projects. How do we balance that? So we need to look at the supply chain risks. I think, and finally, this is a moment for Opergy and our team to lean in. We're already advising at national, regional, strategic levels, working with project developers, working with supply chain companies, helping companies move from one sector into this clean energy kind of space. We're supporting government, developers, investors, partners, communities, and our work across offshore wind, nuclear, hydrogen skills, the kind of wider socioeconomic impacts, and place-based growth positions us at the centre of the transition, certainly here in the UK, and what we're trying to accelerate. So we're not just observing the shift, we're helping to shape it in key areas. I'm really proud of what we've been doing and what we've achieved so far. So today I want us to kind of reflect on three questions. So, where are the biggest gaps between ambition and implementation globally in the UK? Which sectors, nuclear, wind, onshore and offshore, hydrogen, which of those now have the kind of clearest pathways, and which perhaps still lack clarity? And where do we think, Sarah, Rachel, Aaron, where do we think we should focus? What's Opergy's drive on this? Where do we think we can, focus most strategically going into 2026, supporting our clients, right across the country, growing our influence and accelerate delivery? So, going to open up the discussion. Love to hear, your perspectives and start with your kind of reactions. Let me just bring in Sarah. Say hello, Sarah. Spotlight there.
Hi.
And we'll bring in Aaron. And we'll bring in Rachel.
Hello.
So, welcome, team. So where do we want to start? We've got three big questions. Where do we think the biggest gaps are in terms of the translation between ambition and implementation? So turning rhetoric to reality, both globally and in the UK. Which sectors? Nuclear, offshore wind, onshore wind, hydrogen, skills. Where do we think has kind of the clearest pathways and which still lack clarity? And where do we think we should focus as an organisation, as a team? Where do we want to focus most strategically in going into 2026 in terms of everything that we've just been talking about? Who wants to start? And don't make me pick on anybody.
Which question first is it?
Pick one. I don't mind. We can get jump straight in wherever you want to focus.
The first thing obviously you asked was about the sort of perhaps disconnect between ambition and implementation at the minute. I think if you look across the major energy markets in the UK, we're definitely still seeing for offshore wind there's a disconnect between the big news and the big announcements that we're seeing, and then SMEs actually feeling and being able to have clarity in sight of what's coming in that pipeline. I think offshore wind is the one that always hits the headlines. It's the one that's always being spoken about in Parliament. It's the one that's always at the front. So that's probably where the main disconnect, I think, is to people looking in. You hear all these big things, you hear these good words. There's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of the timing of that pipeline and what that looks like, especially for smaller companies looking to plan, invest and make decisions to fully engage in that market, I think.
Thanks, Aaron. I think you're absolutely spot on there. But Sarah, Rachel, do you want to add anything to that, or come in with a different perspective or anything?
I think for me, sorry, you go, Sarah.
No, it's fine.
I think for me, there is clearly a lot of ambition within the country, from Scotland to England to Wales. But where does that ambition connect with enthusiasm from investors to actually begin investing and pushing these projects forward at pace? Because I think that's one of the biggest hurdles we are facing today. Delay after delay after delay, and we're already behind our targets. So what can we do now to encourage these investments?
So again, it's kind of reframing the question in slightly different way, isn't it? So it's kind of how do we turn the what? I think that's quite clear into the how and the when, and trying to accelerate that somewhat. But we'll come back to that. Sorry, Sarah, go on.
Yeah, I echo both what Aaron and Rachel said. Both agree with both of those things. I'd also probably add as well, from my perspective and what I've seen on a couple of recent projects, is a gap between ambition and implementation across England, I'd say. There's lots of rhetoric, continues to be lots of rhetoric about boosting the north and levelling up, and I don't think that's really felt by businesses actually in what happens in their context and what matters them for them day to day. So I think that's a kind of another layer to when's this finance coming, when's that support for the north coming as well.
Yeah, interesting. Do we think, an open question, but just kind of thinking about what we've said, do we think that we are clear in terms of whose responsibility it is to kind of take the next step? Because for me, sometimes all fingers get pointed at governments, and they're central governments or Scottish governments or the Welsh government. They're kind of easy targets. Say government must. Is it on government to do to take the next step? I think government's made some pretty big bold steps in sort of policy terms. Is it industry? Is it where does the supply chain fit? Where do communities fit? Where do local government fit in terms of they are near the local planning authorities? They have a role to play in supporting local regional business. Are we clear on who needs to play which role, or is that still a bit ambiguous to turn the how into to focus on the how rather than the what?
I think if you look at it on government level, you can't say that they're responsible for every single part of transition. I think they have a responsibility in clearing up some of that lack of clarity. And then once that lack of clarity kind of dispels a little bit, you see that investment start to sort of streamline a little bit more. Risk seems a little bit less. And I think you'll find companies and SMEs and the companies mentioned will just sort of feel that confidence a little bit more when that pipeline becomes more visible. So I think it's their job to perhaps clean up that kind of fogginess that you mentioned, and then hopefully things start to look up from there.
I definitely agree with that. I think that a major thing is creating a suitable environment for investment and business confidence, and a lot of that comes from central government side of things. But having said that, I would say that all of those levels have a really important part to play, and the most important thing to do is to have communication and consistency. Messages from a region or from a sector going to government, and that there being a clear and sensible and consistent backwards and forwards conversation. And that's really difficult to achieve with the turnover of politicians that we have, and leading parties and government, and how that also plays out regionally as well. It's very difficult to achieve, but I think that clarity and communication, so that everybody can kind of pull towards the same thing and is giving the right messages, is so important.
Rachel, anything to add on that?
I think Aaron and Sarah have covered all the big points, but if we simplify it a little bit, going back to levels, we can't just rely purely on government. What can we do individually? And for example, if you have a local community with lots of potholes in the road, they're very good at going to Facebook and complaining about it, but they're not actually going to the right people to make a difference. So we need to identify who our local groups are that we can go to and make our position clear and where we want to see change and how we can actually make this change in investment.
Yeah, there's some good points there. Let's just look at the sectors. So we're quite privileged as an organisation, as a team. We kind of work almost equally across nuclear, offshore renewables, onshore renewables, grid, industrial decarbonisation, climate policy, and lots of other things that we do. So I think we kind of come at things that we're sometimes with a slightly more unique perspective than other peers in the industry. So I kind of want to kind of ask your view on which sectors or which technologies do we think now, based on all the chat we've had and everything that's been announced recently, which of them have kind of the clearest pathways for growth or for deliverability, and which are still a little bit ambiguous and lack clarity? Is there some obvious kind of technologies that are kind of bubbling towards the top of the priority list now for deployment? This is much more around kind of deployment, either electrons on the grid or molecules in the pipes, or whatever sort of analogy or terminology you want to use. But what do we think in terms of sort of where we are in terms of different sectors under the energy transition, or different technologies? Who wants to take a punt at that one? And there's no wrong answers to this, by the way, at all.
I think the one that's in the news at the minute and which is getting spoken about a lot is obviously nuclear. That dependence on that base load is growing. Every single day we hear about new things and new policy, but what we do know is having that base level that nuclear will hopefully lessen the strain on other forms of energy and the grid as well, as more of that comes online. So For now, it looks like nuclear is going to be the way that a lot of effort and investment is going to continue to be focused, and then hopefully that will drag along and lift a bit of pressure off of the other types of energies, in the next couple of years as well.
Good point.
I agree. Nuclear has loads of momentum at the moment, and on the flip side, it's kind of a bit of a shame to see a little bit less of momentum going on in offshore wind. That's a hugely successful and industry for the UK, where we have major expertise and loads to offer to grow that sector, and perhaps there's not enough momentum there to really seize all of that opportunity. And I think hydrogen as well is like, there's lots and lots of plans and really promising centres of expertise for hydrogen, with like huge opportunities across a number of those, but it's very slow for progress to be made, and it doesn't feel like there's enough oomph behind those industries to really give them the get up and go to reach their full potential quickly enough, as quickly as we need them.
So good points there. Rachel?
I'll add one more sector that I don't think we should forget, and that's decommissioning. In the recent days post-budget, there's been a real tone of confidence in the northeast and the Aberdeen area. The key theme being what's going to fill the gap between ramping down of oil and gas and the ramping up of offshore wind. So it's looking like decommissioning will play a strong part in this, with companies such as Spirit Energy, Apache and EnQuest all announcing large-scale project pipelines. And this could be a key ingredient in our transition and the stimulus we need to ensure skills they're retained in the northeast while we're experiencing delays in the upcoming sectors. And also one other thing to add on to Sarah's point is that the new DESNZ hydrogen strategy will be coming out in December, and I cannot wait to see what that holds. Hopefully it's got some good direction.
Well, let's hope it gives us the clarity in terms of policy direction, but also where we need to kind of take action, whether it's on hydrogen for transport, hydrogen for power, but certainly on the production and storage side. I think it's been long awaited, and hopefully we'll hopefully supercharge some of that, the how we're going to deliver, and then focus on implementation again. And it's just going to be, I think I completely agree with everything you've said. I just want to add actually on decommissioning, Rachel, completely agree with that. I think for North East Scotland in particular, I think offshore decommissioning, so decommissioning oil and gas platforms, rigs, etc., is absolutely something that we could see to help fill the gap, and sort of stabilize the supply chain and retain skills, jobs, and investment in the ports, absolutely. But it's also decommissioning across the other sectors. So nuclear decommissioning, for example, is going to be a massive sector in itself, and arguably almost going to probably employ as many people as the nuclear new build sector is forecasting to as well, because we have an aging fleet and there's quite a lot of work to do, and it's not a quick job to decommission a nuclear power station. But again, lots of opportunity there for civils, for civil engineering, for mechanical, electrical, digital skills, and so I think there's a huge opportunity across all of these, and sometimes it's challenging because we hear all of the noise around delays in offshore wind, delays in hydrogen. We've seen major companies almost kind of just close down or withdraw from the hydrogen market because of policy delays, and they're putting their investment elsewhere. There's been so much noise around CFDs, contracts for difference, and allocation around 7, and clean industry bonus around offshore wind, and hopefully there'll be some really positive announcements in the new year around AR7. Fingers crossed, and then hopefully that will supercharge delivery. But I think it's still the how and when bit that I think we need to focus on. Policy announcements, investment announcements, award winners, and that's all great. But we very quickly need to kind of translate into how, when, who, what do you need, Mr. Developer or Miss Developer, to unlock that particular sort of construction program. 2030 and the Clean Power 2030 ambition from this government to decarbonise the electricity grid by 95%. Is 5 years away. We haven't started construction of some of these projects. Nuclear is not going to kind of plug that gap in terms of decarbonising the grid. Nuclear is largely going to be a post 2030, but 2030 2040 delivery. So who's going to take the sort of the lion's share of the load there? Is it solar? Is it storage? Is it a bit more wind? Onshore, offshore. So I think there's still a lot of questions that we need to help to some of our clients, government, NESO, various other bodies, help to free frame and help to kind of look at what's the art of the possible, what's deliverable, and and certainly in terms of fast tracking as much of UK-based manufacturing, UK content, because that's the real driver for certainly from government at all levels. So it'd be interesting to see where we take this. Going on to kind of the last question, and again, there's no right or wrong answer here, but I'm so really interested in your views. You're kind of experts in your own spaces. Which where do you think, given the work you do, the programs you lead, the clients you support, the projects you're going to help to get moving, where do you think we as an organisation, where do you think we as a team and Team Opergy should probably focus a little bit more, or strategically focus in 2026? Is there any particular area that is kind of coming through for you guys that we need to put a bit more focus in?
I think perhaps what an opportunity is that in previous years we focused a lot on offshore wind as an organisation, and we've been part of that momentum. And as you can see, other markets are starting to reach that same level of momentum as offshore wind. There's definitely an opportunity for us to help the companies that we're working with to diversify into a host of different markets, sort of understand what their strengths are, what their capabilities are, what can be transferable from one sector to another, and just making sure that we're giving advice that's real, it's realistic, and isn't leading them down lanes that aren't going to go anywhere. So it's about just being honest and giving good advice at this stage, I think.
Yeah, good. Sarah, Rachel?
I think a bit of a golden thread across quite a lot of the different projects and industries that technology types that we get involved in is skills. I think probably it's after kind of permissions to go ahead and financing for these big projects, it's the next blocker to getting them to happen. There's loads of infrastructure development planned across the energy sector, as well as lots of other competing sectors that will be fighting for the same people. And I don't know that that's really well. The problem is very well understood, but I don't know if the solutions are, or there's enough detail in understanding really the skills requirement when and how, and understanding how that challenge in one sector interfaces with the same challenge in other sectors. So I think that's an important area that we work, that we should keep going in, because we've got a lot to offer there.
I like thinking. So Aaron, you're kind of looking at more sort of the sector approach. Sarah, you're kind of looking at actually cut through all the sectors, because you think areas like people and skills are cross-cutting. It's an area that we have done a huge amount of work on. We've got a bit of a niche on. That's some good insights. Rachel, sorry, go on, Sarah.
I also liked what Aaron said about the just being real about the advice we give and the opportunities that are available. That is a major thing in the skills space as well, because there's so much talk about there'll be all this employment and so many promises, and still communities in some very deprived areas think, well, where? So I think that's a really important thing as part of our advice in that area, to be real about it and realistic about what's possible, when and how.
I think that's one of the beauties of what we do as a business, as a team, though, isn't it? That we do try wherever we can to kind of cut through the noise and talk about what is practical, what can people or organizational communities or businesses do. It is kind of that kind of slightly more grounded, practical advice, not kind of big strategic, theoretical, kind of art of the possible. These are the things that you could do, but the bigger prize, it still could be, much bigger if we only do certain things. Rachel, do you want any particular thoughts on where we need to put a bit of focus going into 2026?
Yeah, so I completely agree with everything that's been mentioned already, and sort of just to build on Aaron's point, I think we should be strategically focusing on company strategies, because strategies we might have written for companies 3-4 years ago, with the recent changes in the industries or delays, might need amending in direction to focus on what's actually happening soon.
It's some good stuff. I think for me, I think it's going to be really interesting to see over the next 3 to 6 months, the industry's kind of reaction to some of the these statements and some of the policy announcements. I think it's still quite fresh. People are trying to work out, well, what does the impact of the budget really mean? COP, certainly in the UK, did not have the kind of media attention. It has not been socialised in the way that previous COPs were. And there's a lot of people I've spoken to that didn't really realise that COP was happening because it was so low profile, which is a bit of a shame because it's such a big opportunity for to kind of discuss change. I think the technology announcements, whether it's in nuclear, whether it's in wind, I think nuclear is going to be definitely one of the biggest growth areas that we need to start thinking about. Albeit, as I said earlier, electrons won't hit the grid for a little while, but we need to build the supply chains, we need to build the skills base, we need to start looking at site selection and getting projects through planning now. Well, ideally several years ago, but we need now. And everything that you've all said, company strategies, absolutely focusing on skills, focusing on supply chain capacity building, as well as the people piece, I think is really important. So I think we'll draw it there. Thanks team. Really insightful discussion. What's clear to me is that the landscape is shifting pretty quickly. Just look at the last 24 hours. Momentum's building, but I think the opportunity for us as Opergy to lead, to influence, to support delivery, I think have never been greater. So for me, as we move into 2026, I think our job is going to really be to stay sharp, stay connected, keep helping our clients turn ambition into action, but keep it real, as I think you said, Sarah, as well. So thanks for joining me today. This is the first of these kind of sessions. We're going to go into the new year. So we'll see you with the next one. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.